Okay, gang, let's spend some time talking about Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. As I mentioned in the video introducing American Gothic, one of Hawthorne's ancestors was a judge at the Salem witch trials, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was so embarrassed by that he changed the pronunciation and spelling of his last name. Many of his works are highly critical of the Puritans, including, of course, Young Goodman Brown. Now, Young Goodman Brown is studied in various types of literature classes, including, of course, American literature. There are many ways to look at this story, but, of course, we're going to focus on the horror aspects, and there are more of them than meet the eye. Okay, after a brief discussion of the horrors that are on the surface of the story and somewhat obvious, we're going to focus on some of the deeper underlying horrors that the story explores. One obvious one is hypocrisy and the difficulty of knowing whom we can believe or if we can believe anyone. But what happens if we have faith in each other and what happens if we don't is a deeper, more thought-provoking horror, and one that is particularly frightening in an era when people are expected to lie and virtually everything is a lie. I recently learned that one of the hottest new terms is post-truth era, which we supposedly live in. I personally find that a little frightening. Now, while horror works do reflect the fears of the culture that created them, many of those horrors are as relevant in this culture as they were in the culture that produced them, and sometimes even more relevant. Let's talk first about some of the surface horrors of the story. Clearly, meeting the devil in any context is frightening. Now, there was a belief in early America that if a person spoke the devil's name, he would appear, which is where that phrase, "speak of the devil," comes from. Now, of course, young Goodman Brown knew this, so speaking the devil's name kind of indicates that he's already begun to lose his faith even before the other events in the story take place. But we know that anyway, because he has already left behind his wife, Faith, whose name is symbolically significant, of course. Also, the fact that the devil has taken the form of young Goodman Brown's father is important. We know that young Goodman Brown was raised in the church, and since early America was definitely patriarchal, I think we can assume that his father had reinforced the church's teachings. By taking the form of his father, the devil is already casting doubts about whom young Goodman Brown should believe. Now, the discussion of the coven in this story, in and of itself, is a fairly nice little piece of horror writing, considering when it was written. Now, as the video clip of the film depicts, even the sight of the gathering, with the fire, the devil at a pulpit, and the presence of Native Americans who were considered vicious heathens by most early Americans, is rather frightening. But what's more frightening for young Goodman Brown is who is present. His mother, Goody Cloyce, the minister and a deacon, whom he had already seen in the woods, and eventually even his wife Faith, whom young Goodman Brown envisions as the embodiment of everything that is pure, good, and holy in the world, is at the coven. Now, if you think that isn't horrifying, imagine how you would feel if you discovered that the people who had taught you what it meant to be a good person were actually Satan worshippers. Just thinking about that makes my heart ache, and makes me wonder whether anything they taught me about being a good person was true. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that horror a little later. First, let's talk about hypocrisy. As the devil points out during his speech at the coven, the people gathered there includes most of the people of young Goodman Brown's village, and we learn that they're not what they appear to be on the surface. Young women that young Goodman Brown most likely believed to be virgins had buried small corpses in their backyards, the devil tells us. Now, infanticide is horrible enough, But we have to remember that young women who became pregnant outside of marriage at that time were often pilloried in the square or even run out of town. Since these women at the coven had probably had secret pregnancies, the implication is that these women performed abortions on themselves. Now, no matter where you stand on the modern abortion issue, you have to understand what a horrible sin that the villagers would have seen this as. Along with these young women were young men who had killed their fathers in order to be able to get their inheritance early. Patricide, of course, is still considered appalling, but it probably would have been viewed even more darkly in the patriarchal era with great religious intensities. In that case, the father was usually deemed to be God's representative in the family. If that's true, then killing your father might be viewed as a direct attack on God, right? We tend to think that hypocrisy is more common among hardened older people, and it probably is in most cases. So if even the young maidens and young Goodman had perpetrated horrendous crimes, what does that say about the older villagers? As if learning that even the very young in Salem were hypocrites isn't bad enough for young Goodman Brown, he sees in the gathering virtually everyone who has taught him the meaning of good and evil and how to be a good man and hope for a joyous afterlife. He's already seen his own minister and a respected deacon of his church in the woods, as well as Goody Cloyes, who had taught him the Bible. But his mother, his very own mother, is also at the coven. We have to remember that mothers were responsible for educating the young before public schools were established. And if young Goodman Brown's mother had not included religious and ethical training in his education, he probably wouldn't have been called a Goodman in his village. Virtually everyone who has been responsible for young Goodman Brown's life, upbringing, and education are at that coven, proving that they were all hypocrites who pretended to be virtuous and holy and preached the importance of those traits. If the people who teach us are hypocrites, how can we believe anything they've taught us? One of the problems with lies is that once a person is discovered in a lie, it's difficult to believe anything they say. So that means that young Goodman Brown has seen a hypocrisy in false teachings. And as horrifying as this situation is today, and it is, imagine living in an era when everything about your life would have been geared toward gaining entry to heaven. Remember that you would have been taught that virtually everything associated with this life, and certainly everything that makes it pleasant, was to be shunned as sinful. You would have been taught that this life is nothing more than a painful trial, and that the only hope for happiness lies in the afterlife. And you would have lived your entire life based on those teachings. This is the situation that young Goodman Brown faces. So when he sees everyone who has taught him the principles that he has based his life on is a hypocrite, he must wonder whether everything they taught him was a lie, right? If it is, he has wasted his youth and his entire life up to that point believing lies and living according to lies. And worse, it must have at least crossed young Goodman Brown's mind that his eternal soul is in danger at a time when the only source of happiness lies in the afterlife. These people have presented themselves as the experts on how to serve God and how to reach heaven, but every single one of them is a hypocrite. Could young Goodman Brown believe anything he has been taught? Can he believe that he knows how to serve God? For that matter, can he even believe there is a God? Now, as a culture, we don't live with the religious intensities that the Puritans did. But we do live in a time when we don't know whom we can trust or if we can trust anyone. Beginning with Watergate in the 1970s, we learned that we can't trust our government officials. It's not even a matter of just not being able to expect them to keep their campaign promises. We don't have any idea what their true agendas are or what they're doing that we don't know about. We know that some of them have been discovered to cheat on their spouses, use drugs, or in some cases commit out-and-out crimes. We also know that in this land of the free, that's based on the notion that people are born with the right to pursue happiness, our government is spying on us continually. So it's not just the individual politicians we can't trust, it's the very institution of our government that is based on hypocrisy. We also know that we can't always trust our religious leaders. In the 1980s, televangelists were popular, outspoken, and certainly nationally known. But one after the other, they were caught committing the very sins they preached against. Of course, anyone who's been a consumer in this country for more than 15 minutes knows that we can't trust corporate America at all anymore. Before the internet allowed everything to be run by huge nationwide corporations, consumers were important. In fact, the saying was that the customer is always right. Now, the consumer is a disposable commodity, and there isn't even an attempt to answer consumer questions or hear our complaints. That's what those 800 numbers are all about, to prevent us from reaching anyone who can actually address problems. And of course, the 2008 economic disaster taught us that we can't trust banks or even the very basis of our economy. And it's not as if the leaders in these areas are honest about who they are, what matters to them, and what they're doing. They smile so sweetly as they lie and lie and lie. We live in a nation of hypocrites. Okay, if everyone is a hypocrite and everything we're told is a lie, it might appear to be better to trust no one. But what happens if we don't trust each other? Well, Hawthorne indicates that it doesn't really matter whether young Goodman Brown attends a coven or falls asleep and has a bad dream. Either way, his dying day is doom. And it's not because he has attended a coven. It's because of how he reacts to that experience. He believes everyone around him is a hypocrite. And in his mind, even his beloved wife Faith has decided to join in league with the devil. And it's his lack of trust that makes him a bitter, sour man who has no real friends because he doesn't trust anyone, which is probably just as well because bitter, sour people find it difficult to attract friends to begin with. Considering that he apparently feels betrayed by everyone, he probably doesn't even truly love his wife because, after all, she's seen at the coven too and is a lying hypocrite. That means that he lives without love, without hope, without faith, and without happiness. We have to ask, will our dying day be doom if we don't trust each other? Now also, as we discussed, young Goodman Brown surely is led to question whether the principles he has based his life on are true. If we believe that we can't trust our national, religious, and economic institutions and what they tell us, what can we base our lives on? If that doesn't lead to living and dying days that are doomed, I don't know what does. Okay, so we don't want to be sour, bitter people whose dying days are doomed. What are the consequences of trusting each other? Well, first of all, of course, there is a possibility that we will, as a culture, be overpowered and destroyed by the people who head up our various institutions. Look at what has been going on as a result of our trust. In 2008, many people lost their homes because of poor decisions made by our economic leaders. On the political end, we've seen one president leave office in shame and another impeached, both during their second terms of office, because we trusted them. We've watched the quality of both goods and services take a nosedive because we trusted corporate leaders. Yes, trusting might have kept us from becoming bitter and sour, but it's come at a cost. That's true in our personal lives too, of course. Most of us have seen the results of trusting the wrong individuals. Either we or people we know have suffered deep emotional pain when those we believed in most turned out to be devious and completely self-centered. Some of us might have even been led by close friends in ways that have cost us a great deal financially. Of course, some people have been physically abused by parents or spouses. We've been manipulated, and we felt deep shame that we've allowed ourselves to be manipulated. Now, Hawthorne didn't write a story about what might have happened if young Goodman Brown had seen everyone he had trusted at a coven and gone on trusting them anyway. And we have to ask, would his dying day have been doom of a different sort if he had trusted them? Now wait a minute, you may be saying. Let's not fall into an either-or fallacy here. Obviously, no one should trust everyone they meet. That could have dire and even deadly consequences. But trusting no one doesn't have to be the alternative. How about trusting some people? Well, of course that's the best option. But Hawthorne warns us about that too, doesn't he? It's not just the minister, the deacon, and Goody Cloyes that young Goodman Brown sees at the coven. It's his mother. It's his father, who shaped the devil himself, is assumed. And worst of all is his beloved wife, his Faith, whom he thought he knew and could trust. What happens when faith itself is hypocrisy? Now, young Goodman Brown is one of the pieces that we're going to study that doesn't follow Stephen King's formula. The evil isn't captured and controlled at the end, reassuring us that we have control over our lives, and that the evil in our culture can be captured and contained, and so all will be well. Hawthorne avoids any kind of response to the question of whom we can trust, or how we can be sure that the people we trust are trustworthy. Hawthorne, we recall, was commenting on the hypocrisy of the Puritans, of course, not of everyone. But by including everyone that young Goodman Brown has trusted and loved in the coven, he has implied that it's possible that we can't trust anyone. But on the other hand, he questions whether young Goodman Brown had attended a coven or simply had a dream, which means that sometimes we can't even trust ourselves. And by saying that young Goodman Brown's dying day is doom, he seems to warn us against the bitterness that can result from trusting no one. Ultimately, maybe having to face this doubt is the greatest horror of all. Thank you so much for listening to this short video on young Goodman Brown. I hope that it helped point out some of the horrors that are underlying this story. And I also hope it didn't depress you too much. Some of the stories that we read don't have that ending that Stephen King spoke of, where the bad guy or the monster is caught in the end, and that kind of doesn't leave us with that sense of closure that we need, and according to King, is the reason that we like horror to begin with. But don't worry, I personally don't feel that the whole world is evil and bad, and I don't want you to either. Thanks again for listening. If you have any questions, don't forget that you can email me from an account other than cannabis, of course, at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Have a great day. Try to spend some time having some fun, and we'll talk again soon.